October 12, 1942 marked the beginning of what would become one of the Mediterranean War's most perplexing mysteries. Commander Wolfgang Schmidt stood on the bridge of his destroyer, watching the dark waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea with growing contempt. Intelligence reports had warned him about the American patrol torpedo boats. Those insignificant plywood vessels the enemy called PT boats. As another squadron of these craft roared across the moonlit waves, their engines screaming like wounded animals, Schmidt allowed himself a thin smile. The Imperial German Navy had faced the combined might of battleships and carriers. These mosquito boats seemed hardly worth the ammunition. The PT boats had arrived in the Italian theater with grand promises. Built by Higgins and Elko at American shipyards, these 80-foot craft carried 4 torpedo tubes and bristled with machine guns. Their wooden hulls could slice through water at over 42 knots, making them theoretically perfect for hit-and-run attacks against the mighty German fleet. Lieutenant Commander Robert Patterson, tasked with coordinating PT boat operations from Palermo, had watched dozens of these boats deploy into combat with high expectations. The Navy's propaganda machine had already dubbed them the Sea Wolves of the Mediterranean, but Patterson harbored private doubts that would soon prove prophetic. The first major engagement came on the night of October 18, 1942, when 6 PT boats intercepted a German convoy near Anzio. Engines roaring at full throttle, the boats charged toward their targets like knights in a medieval joust. Torpedo after torpedo leaped from their tubes, trailing phosphorescent wakes across the black water. The crews watched with held breath as their weapons streaked toward hulking enemy transports and destroyers. Then came the crushing anticlimax. Nothing happened. One torpedo passed directly beneath a transport's keel without detonating. Another struck a destroyer amidships with a metallic clang that echoed across the water only to bounce off harmlessly and sink into the depths. Commander Schmidt received reports of the attack the following morning. According to historical records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, German officers in the Mediterranean Fleet headquarters actually laughed when reading the after-action reports. The Americans had fired 19 torpedoes in that single engagement. 0 hits, 0 damage. The PT boats had retreated under heavy fire, their heroic charge amounting to nothing more than wasted ordnance and fuel. Schmidt ordered his staff to compile similar reports from other encounters. The pattern was unmistakable and, from the German perspective, darkly amusing. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley commanded PT-127, one of the boats involved in the Anzio fiasco. His after-action report dripped with frustration, barely contained by military formality. The torpedoes had run true. The attacks executed according to doctrine. Yet the German ships had sailed on as if the PT boats didn't exist. Bradley's crew had risked their lives charging into range of destroyers that could have blown them apart with a single salvo. For what? The humiliation of watching their torpedoes malfunction or miss became a bitter joke among the PT boat squadrons. They had charged into battle with wooden swords, expecting to slay giants, only to discover their weapons were toys. October 15, 1942 brought renewed urgency to the torpedo problem, though few in the Navy's upper echelons wanted to acknowledge it. Captain David Lee, commander of submarines operating from Naples, Italy, had been filing increasingly angry reports about torpedo failures since the war's opening days. His submarine skippers reported the same maddening pattern: torpedoes running too deep, failing to detonate on contact, or suffering premature explosions that warn targets without inflicting damage. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington dismissed these complaints with bureaucratic arrogance that would later seem criminal in its negligence. The Mark 15 torpedo, designed specifically for PT boats and aircraft, embodied everything wrong with pre-war American weapons development. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, had created a weapon based on peacetime assumptions and minimal testing. The torpedo's magnetic exploder, designated the Mark 6, was supposed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking its back through hydrostatic pressure. In theory, this made it devastatingly effective, In practice, the magnetic exploder was so sensitive to Earth's magnetic field variations that it rarely worked as intended. The Mediterranean's magnetic environment differed significantly from the Atlantic waters, where limited testing had occurred. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley experienced the torpedo problem's deadly consequences firsthand on October 22, 1942. His PT-178 had stalked a German cruiser for over an hour, maneuvering into perfect attack position despite heavy seas. At 750 yards, point-blank range for a torpedo attack, Bradley gave the order to fire. All 4 torpedoes leaped from their tubes. The first torpedo's warhead exploded prematurely just 180 yards from launch, nearly swamping the PT boat with its blast. The second torpedo's engine failed, sending it spiraling uselessly into the depths. The third torpedo porpoised, breaking the surface repeatedly before diving deep and passing far beneath the cruiser. Only the fourth torpedo ran true, striking the cruiser's hull with a satisfying clang that brought cheers from Bradley's crew. The cheers died when nothing happened. The warhead had failed to detonate. The German cruiser's response was swift and merciless. Searchlights snapped on, pinning PT-178 like a moth on a board. 5-inch guns thundered, hurling shells that threw up enormous water spouts around the fleeing PT boat. Bradley threw the helm hard over, engines screaming at maximum power, and somehow escaped into the darkness. 3 of his crewmen had been wounded by shell fragments. His boat had burned through precious fuel for nothing. The German cruiser sailed on, probably unaware how close it had come to actual danger. Admiral Chester Morrison, commander of the United States Fleet, finally ordered a comprehensive investigation in December 1942. The findings compiled by teams of engineers and combat officers revealed a scandal that reached into the highest levels of naval procurement. The Mark 15 torpedo had never been adequately tested under combat conditions. Its magnetic exploder was fundamentally flawed. Its depth-setting mechanism was unreliable. Its contact exploder designed as a backup was too fragile and often shattered on impact without triggering detonation. Essentially, the Navy had sent men into battle with weapons that didn't work, then blamed those men when the weapons failed. The Germans, meanwhile, continued monitoring PT boat activities with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. Vice Admiral Heinrich Kasaka, commanding Mediterranean Area Fleet Operations, noted in his diary that American torpedo boats had now fired over 110 torpedoes with virtually nothing to show for it. His staff officers joked about the American fireworks displays that preceded each PT boat retreat. The psychological impact on American crews was devastating, eroding confidence in their weapons and their mission at a time when the Mediterranean War's outcome remained desperately uncertain. December 19th, 1942 dawned gray and oppressive over Sicily, where the ground campaign had devolved into a brutal stalemate. PT boat squadrons operating from Palermo found themselves thrust into roles never envisioned by their designers. With torpedoes proving unreliable, squadron commanders began emphasizing the boat's machine guns and small cannons. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Kelly, who had evacuated General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines aboard PT-41, now found himself leading attacks where PT boats served primarily as floating gun platforms. The Rome Express, Allied forces' sardonic nickname for German high-speed reinforcement runs down the Italian coast, presented both opportunity and frustration for PT boat crews. German destroyers and fast cruisers would race south under cover of darkness, delivering troops and supplies to Sicily before dawn forced them to retreat beyond American air power's reach. These vessels moved at 37 knots or faster, making them extremely difficult targets. Even if the torpedoes had worked properly, PT boats would struggle to intercept these runs, their commanders knowing that torpedo attacks would likely prove futile but feeling compelled to try anyway. On the night of December 25th, 1942, PT boats participated in one of the war's most chaotic naval battles. The Naval Battle of Sicily saw American and German surface forces clashing at point-blank range in the Strait of Messina. 6 PT boats, including Lieutenant Bradley's 127, found themselves caught in the middle of a battleship and cruiser slugfest. Bradley later described the scene as something from Dante's Inferno. Ships exploding, tracers crisscrossing the sky in every direction, the water illuminated by burning vessels and star shells. His boat fired all 4 torpedoes at targets of opportunity. He never knew if any hit and suspected none did. The battle's confusion made accurate damage assessment impossible, but post-war German records revealed no torpedo damage to major vessels during that engagement. The psychological toll on PT boat crews became increasingly evident. Ensign Robert Hayes, assigned to PT 84, wrote letters home that captured the growing despair. He described the sick feeling in his stomach when ordered to make torpedo runs. Knowing the odds of success approached zero, his boat had fired 18 torpedoes in combat. 18 failures. Hayes wrote about watching torpedoes pass directly under enemy ships without exploding or striking hulls with audible clangs before sinking their warheads unarmed. He questioned whether he and his crew were cowards for feeling relieved when torpedo attacks failed, sparing them the extended gun duels that invariably followed when they pressed attacks home. The Bureau of Ordnance finally authorized field modifications in February 1943. PT boat tenders at Palermo began deactivating the troublesome magnetic exploders, relying solely on contact detonators. Engineers adjusted depth settings, trying to compensate for the torpedo's tendency to run deeper than intended. These modifications helped, but they couldn't fix fundamental design flaws. The contact exploder's fragility remained. Torpedoes still ran erratically. The improvements were marginal at best, raising the success rate from abysmal to merely terrible. Commander Patterson calculated that PT boats were now achieving roughly a 6% hit rate, 1 functioning hit for every 17 torpedoes fired. By naval standards, this represented catastrophic failure. German commanders noted the slight improvement in PT boat effectiveness, but their fundamental contempt remained unchanged. Captain Wilhelm Harre, commanding the destroyer Schergar, wrote in his memoirs about PT boat attacks during this period. He described them as nuisance raids that rarely threatened properly handled warships. His destroyer had been attacked by PT boats on 5 separate occasions. Not once had a torpedo come close to hitting. Harre's greatest concern during these attacks was not the torpedoes, but the possibility of collision with a PT boat in the darkness, a humiliating way to damage his vessel. March 8, 1943 would etch itself in history for reasons having nothing to do with torpedo effectiveness. Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph Patterson, commanding PT 127, was patrolling the Strait of Messina with his crew of 13 when the German destroyer column materialized from the darkness. What happened next would be debated for decades, analyzed by historians, and shaped by political considerations. But the basic facts were undeniable and deeply embarrassing for the PT boat program. The column under Commander Fritz Hanami's command was part of a Rome express run delivering supplies and troops to Sicily. Hanami's destroyer was making 32 knots when lookouts spotted PT 127 at approximately 220 yards. Patterson's boat was idling on one engine to reduce noise and wake visibility, a common tactic during night patrols. What should have been a textbook torpedo boat ambush instead became a disaster. Patterson apparently never saw the destroyer until it was nearly on top of his boat. He gunned his engines trying to turn into attack position, but the laws of physics and momentum were unforgiving. The column struck PT 127 amidships, nearly cutting the plywood boat in half. The collision was catastrophic. The impact killed 3 of Patterson's crew instantly. By May 1943, the torpedo count had surpassed 748 torpedoes fired in combat by PT boats in the Italian campaign. The confirmed sinking tally remained in single digits.